virus that we are experiencing right now. We've heard that cigarette smoking makes it that much more lethal. We've also heard that cigarette smoking protects us from getting it. We've heard certain medications promoted by some people and discounted by others. Lots and lots and lots of information out there. And there's an important lesson that we can get from all of this, because much of this so-called information, or misinformation if you want, is being done in the name of science. There is something else that's kind of important to keep in mind as well, and that is, why is all of this information being thrown at us? Well, I think that Aristotle really hit the nail on the head with the first sentence of in metaphysics. It's a great thing. You don't really have to read beyond that to get some profound wisdom. Aristotle said, all men by nature desire to know. All of us want to know what's going on with COVID-19, but with many, many other things. It's not just things to do with healthcare. That's why people read the newspaper. That's why, or go on to the, BBC website or CNN or something like that. They're looking for information. They want to know things. This is a good thing that's built into human beings, but it also makes us hungry for information, even when it isn't there. And people have a tendency to fill in vacuums in information, sometimes for their advantage and sometimes for their own, for your advantage. It just depends. We have to use some wisdom in deciding whether the person who's telling us something actually knows something or whether they do not. And we need to understand for ourselves whether we know things or we don't know things. I'm desperately trying not to make a joke about the President of the United States right now, but I won't do that. So the point that I want you to get out of the example of COVID-19 that I'm using to illustrate this is that science excels at providing some answers. For example, with the COVID-19 virus, we got the DNA sequence or the RNA sequence of that particular virus in a very short period of time. We know exactly the recipe for it. But science also struggles in surprising ways to address other questions about nature. And this is what we're finding out right now. We don't really know whether what we're doing is truly impacting the spread of this thing. We don't have a medical solution to it at the moment. It's a pretty frightening situation, and science, maybe it will provide us with some great answers, but it's sort of taking a little bit longer than we would have hoped. Where science does not provide answers, speculations based on philosophical assumptions may be substituted as if they're scientific, or at least reliable. Here's a nice example of this. This is something that was written by a guy who died around 55 years before Jesus Christ was born. So he was writing well over 2,000 years ago. His name was Titus Lucretius Carus, and he wrote this in Latin, not English, but I'll give it to you in English. He wrote, "But atoms were struck with blows in many ways and carried along by their own weight from infinite times up to the present. They have been accustomed to move and to meet in all manner of ways. For this reason it came to pass that being spread abroad through vast space and trying every sort of combination and motion. At length, those came together that produced great things like earth and sea and sky and the generation of living creatures. So Lucretius had a theory, a hypothesis, really, about where living things come from, where life comes from, the origin of life. It is a materialistic hypothesis that he's putting forward here. Now, a lot of people consider materialistic explanations to be scientific. I don't believe they really are. They are philosophical in nature, but they may also be scientific. I want to spend a considerable amount of time on science right now, but it's essential that we understand what kind of science we're talking about, because there are really two distinctly different kinds. We'll start out with experimental science. This is the kind of science that allows us to get the sequence of a virus's genome in a very short period of time now. Experimental science deals with natural phenomena that are repeatable. So, if a scientist in Argentina combined hydrogen and oxygen and got water 20 years ago, a Bulgarian scientist can do the same experiment and get water today. In fact, if you're like me, I went to high school in Singapore, and I did this experiment many times. Our principal got progressively more upset the more often we did this experiment, especially when we did it right outside his office one day. There was no permanent damage done, but it was a fun experiment to do, combining that hydrogen and oxygen. Then there's historical science. It deals with events of the past that are not repeatable because time only goes in one direction. We cannot go back in time, except in the movies, of course. A scientist discovers craters on the moon and infers that asteroids impacted the moon in the past. And another scientist can look at the same craters and make the same inference, but neither can repeat the exact events that caused the craters in the first place. Nobody can go back in time and do that. And often with historical things, there can be multiple possible explanations for some, multiple hypotheses, if you want, out there. We could say, maybe astronauts went up there thousands of years ago and dug those craters out just to fool us or something. Obviously, that's not a theory or a hypothesis I would be particularly inclined to believe. But the point is, there are lots of possible hypotheses that you can come up with. How do you decide between them, especially when you can't do the experiment over and over and over again? You can't go back in time. Here is Carol Cleland, and she is talking about this business of historical science. How do we get information? How do we know things based on this particular kind of science? She writes, instead of inferring test implications from a target hypothesis and performing a series of experiments, historical scientists focus their attention on formulating mutually exclusive hypotheses. That's the key thing, mutually exclusive hypotheses, and hunting for evidentiary traces to discriminate among them. The goal is to discover a smoking gun. A smoking gun is a trace that unambiguously discriminates one hypothesis from among a set of currently available hypotheses, thus providing the best explanation of the traces thus far observed. So we're looking for hypotheses and we're looking for evidence that discriminates between them in some way. Evidence that tells us that hypothesis over there is still alive and this other hypothesis really does not work. So here are multiple competing hypotheses about the origin of life. Materialism is essentially a hypothesis or a worldview, if you want, or a philosophical starting point. And it says that life is the product of a process that involves natural laws, unguided interactions, we call it that chance commonly, and nothing else. There is no supernatural out there. There's no spirit out there. There's nothing like that. You only have, as Lucretius pointed out, atoms and motion, or atoms and energy at the end of the day. Those are your tools, atoms and actually I should say a set of natural laws that govern the interactions between these chance encounters between atoms. That's all you've got, and you have to get living things out of that, according to the materialistic view. Then there's the theistic view. This is the one that believes in some kind of God. And in that view, at least one hypothesis this is that life is the product of an intelligent cause acting on matter and exploiting natural laws to achieve a specific outcome. There's some kind of intelligence in this process that we're talking about. So here we have two hypotheses. Now we are going to be historical scientists, and we're going to look at life and try to see which of these hypotheses is kept alive by the evidence that we're looking at, which is not really a viable hypothesis. We need to start out by defining what life is. What is life? Without a definition for life, the problem of how life began is not well posed. That's what we're going to do right now. We're going to follow the advice here of Paul Davies and Sarah Walker. So what is life? Remember, Confucius said that we need to acknowledge when we don't know stuff. I've been studying life pretty much all of my life, and I will tell you, I don't know what it is, and neither does anyone else. That's why biology is so fantastic. It's almost infinitely interesting because the more we study it, the more we find out about it, and the more we realize that we don't know it all. But we do know life when we see it. And typically in textbooks, what you see are a list of characteristics that all life has. And those characteristics, we say, well, you know, if something has all of those characteristics, then it's probably alive. The first thing is cells. Living things are made out of cells. Those cells do a process we call metabolism. They're taking in energy and chemicals and things like that, and things are being converted and stuff. And there's all sorts of this very interesting series of events that are going on inside every cell if it's alive. Then there's reproduction. All living things do that. There's development and growth, and there's homeostasis. There's a certain set of conditions that's maintained inside living things that allow them to live, even though their environment may be changing. So, for example, there in the United Kingdom, you're coming out of winter, and your body, because you're a living thing, has maintained certain internal conditions that have allowed you to survive that winter. When you've gone outside, your body temperature has been maintained. If it isn't maintained, then you die. temperature is just one example of many factors that are kept constant inside, at least, inside living things, inside humans in this example, that are absolutely necessary, or you're not alive. And then there's adaptability. Your metabolism changed when you went outside on a cold day. There was an increase in your metabolic rate that produced heat to keep you warm, thus maintaining homeostasis. So you can see that these things are all related to one another. If something exhibits those 6 traits, we generally say, yes, it's alive, but it really doesn't, just this list of traits really doesn't tell us what life is. Here are Sarah Walker and Paul Davies again talking about what life is. And they say, although it is notoriously hard to identify precisely what makes life so distinctive and remarkable, there is general agreement that its information aspect is one key property, and perhaps the key property. The manner in which information flows through and between cells and subcellular structures is quite unlike anything else observed in nature. If life is more than just a complex chemistry, its unique informational management properties may be the crucial indicator of this distinction, which raises the all-important question of how the information properties characteristic of life, of living systems, arose in the first place. Where does information come from? Because if you're going to have a living thing, it is going to be information rich. Life is an information containing and processing system centered around the genome, that DNA that you find in your cells. It's not everything. The DNA isn't everything. But the information that's in that DNA is really, really important. If you are looking at human DNA, if I were to take the DNA that's found in every one of your cells, strung out, it would be approximately 2 meters long. Now you have 2 copies of it, one from your mother and one from your father. Each one of those copies is approximately 3 billion letters long. These are actually little chemicals that act like letters of the alphabet. 3 billion. There is a massive amount of information that is encoded in the human genome, but even more in some other genomes. For example, if you're eating corn, maize, someday, think about the fact that maize has a larger genome than your genome. There are even single-celled organisms that have larger genomes than those that we have. So we can't get too arrogant about ours. It's fairly typical of organisms that are similar to us. There is a massive amount of information out there that's stored in DNA. And the question is, where does information come from? We actually know. Sometimes people want to say, well, you're using a God of the gaps argument when you talk about things like God is necessary to explain living things or something. But there is no gap here. We know where information comes from. Even the Daily Mail is written by human beings, intelligent humans. And as a consequence of that, we can make a reasonable inference. Where we find information, it originates in intelligence of some kind. Here's another thing that we can observe about living things, not just information. Biological systems are more than the sum of their parts. The combination of parts produce emergent properties, properties present only because of the combination and not intrinsic to any single part. So let me illustrate this with something we're all familiar with: wheels. A wheel by itself isn't a transportation device. You might be able to use it for something else, I don't know, rolling down a hill or something. But by alone, a wheel just doesn't do anything. And bicycle frames don't do anything by themselves. They're not a transportation device either. But when we put wheels and a bicycle frame and some other parts together, we end up with a bicycle that has this emergent property of being this very efficient transportation device. Here's a biological example of this. If made only of contracting ventricles, the heart would not pump blood. This isn't speculation. We know this because sometimes the valves in somebody's heart will fail and their ventricles are perfectly good. They're pumping away, but the person will die without functioning valves. So likewise, valves alone could not move blood. It's the combined work of ventricles and valves that moves blood through the heart and out to the body. We have to have these parts together. Emergent properties are absolutely central to life. Now, yesterday, Dr. Noble showed you this illustration, and there's this zoomed-in view that we can look at of this bacterial flagellum. And when you look at that flagellum, it's essentially a transportation device as well, just like a bicycle, I guess, in some ways. It's like an outboard motor, and it has various parts, like the filament that acts like a propeller and the hook that acts like a universal joint and all of these other parts. You've got to have this central set of parts if you are going to get that function, that emergent property out of these bits and pieces. Now, you might be able to remove one or two bits. That's fine. That doesn't, by the way, mean that those bits are doing nothing. It just means that they contribute in some tangential way to the central function of whatever this device is that we're looking at. We call this property of being, of requiring a certain set of parts for the function to exist, irreducible complexity. We can't go to less parts and still have whatever that function is there. And this property we see commonly in living things. Here's another example. This is the ATP synthase from E. coli bacteria that are found inside your gut, but all of your cells have this this basic structure as well, where you have something that acts essentially as a turbine, and it transmits torque via a drive shaft protein to something that acts as a generator. In fact, right now, if you've already eaten your tea, then you will be using this to make energy that is keeping you awake and, of course, fascinated by what I'm saying. The point that I want you to get from this is that life is not just a genome. It isn't just information. It is an interactome. The parts that make up living things must interact in very specific ways. The information then must code for parts that will interact in those ways as well. So you can't just make a part and say, whoa, there you go, we're halfway to getting a living thing. No, you've got to have all the parts of all the components that are going to make up a cell. And by the way, even then, you don't have a living organism, as the unfortunate example of the graveyard that I showed you at the beginning tells us. Um, you know, with most of those men, all of the bits and pieces were actually still there. They'd just been mildly disrupted and they were no longer living. All of the parts must be interacting appropriately if we're going to have life. Now, when we see something like this, it makes us think of this great word, teleology. Teleology is the idea of having a goal that is being worked towards. In a materialistic view of things, there can be no teleology because there's no mind that is working towards some kind of goal. Only intelligent agents are known to be capable of conceptualizing a goal and conceiving a way of achieving that goal through the production and combination of different tightly specified parts. So, like information, which only comes from intelligence, an intelligent agent, these interacting parts that we see working together to make these machines and things inside living things, they require, or they are best explained in terms of some intelligent agent as well. I want to draw your attention to one other thing. This is a diagram or a model of the nitrogen cycle. And this is essential to life on Earth. You wouldn't be alive without it, neither would any other living thing. And the interesting thing about it is that it's all done by multiple different organisms. This is called an ecological cycle. And I want to make a very, very important point based on this. That is, you've got to have all of this working or life can't exist. Living things are not individuals. There is no such thing as individual life. Human beings are more than just the parts from which, or more than just themselves, more than just human cells. In fact, there are probably more non-human cells in a human being than there are human cells, which is a bit of a spooky thought when you think about it. Remember, you've got a whole zoo down in your gut, for example. The great thing is it's mostly bacteria, or to a large degree bacteria, and bacterial cells do tend to be somewhat smaller than the eukaryotic cells that humans are made out of. So as a consequence of that, we can have a lot more of them in a smaller space. But we're covered with other organisms. We have them inside ourselves. We could not survive without them. And we could not survive with a whole bunch of organisms that live outside of us as well. Individual or a single, the idea of a single thing turning into a living thing is not viable because we need not an individual first living thing. We need an ecology for that living thing to exist in, and that ecology includes other organisms. Now, let's go back to Aristotle. Aristotle was trying to figure out where living things came from as well. And lots of people think of him as being really the father of modern science. He wasn't the best observer. He came up with some rather odd ideas, like the idea that women have less teeth in their mouths than men. You'd think he would have just gone out and counted the teeth in women's mouths or something, but apparently that it was he believed his own theory more than he really wanted to test it against data or something anyway. But while he was brilliant and he had some really good insights, he believed that living things, at least some living things, came about via spontaneous generation, that they just sort of came about. Here he writes, as a general rule, then, all testations, that's the shell-bearing animals, grow by spontaneous generation in mud. In other words, they don't come from parents, they just sort of appear in the mud. Differing from one another according to the differences of the material, oysters growing in slime and cockles and other testations above mentioned on sandy bottoms. So this theory of spontaneous generation of living things is ancient. It's not a new thing. But we know that in relatively modern times, experimental science was used to demonstrate that this idea of spontaneous generation of life from non-living things does not happen. We have Francisco Redi back in the 1600s, Abbe Spallanzani, late 1700s, Theodor Schwann and Franz Schulz, 1854, and probably, I think, arguably the most brilliant scientist of the 19th century, even though he was French, Louis Pasteur. And Louis Pasteur really did the definitive experiments that demonstrated that even bacteria do not come about by spontaneous generation. It just doesn't happen. That's why in biology, just note the date here. This is 1861. If you look at Charles Darwin, who would have been aware of all of this, it's not that he didn't know. Charles Darwin in 1871, so a decade basically after this brilliant work by Pasteur, which was widely discussed and widely reported, he's speculating on where life came from. This is in a letter, and he says, if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. So what Darwin's really asking us to do here is ignore what we've observed and just sort of speculate about what might happen based upon, I don't know, whatever, certainly not our observations, because our observations show that we never see this happening. But he was a materialist, and therefore he was looking for a materialistic explanation for things, just as Lucretius had been 2,000 years before him, or almost 2,000 years before him. Come up to 1900, and we have Ernst Haeckel, who was a huge promoter of Darwinism, particularly in Germany. And he's summarizing all of the knowledge that's been gained in the 19th century, and in this book that he wrote. And he writes, the Monera, that's the bacteria, which consist only of this primitive protoplasm and which arise by spontaneous generation from these inorganic nitrocarbonates, may thus have entered upon the same course of evolution on many other planets. I mean, this is speculation. It is speculation that is coming from this materialistic starting point. And that's vital to understand. It is not based on scientific observation. It is filling in a gap in knowledge with speculation that is driven by bad philosophy, at least in my opinion. He doesn't just say this once here again. He says, first simple Monera are formed by spontaneous generation, and from these arise unicellular protists. So he's really, really into this thing. This has to be true if you are a materialist, if you're starting with only the material world to work with. Going back again, this is actually before Darwin was, talking about these things in his warm little pond. We have Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley was a brilliant man. He's trying to come up with a framework for thinking about these things, because he was a supporter of Darwin as well, although they did have their disagreements. He came up with some, when you're having a discussion about things, it's very important to get very clear definitions of words and things. So he's coming up with some new words. He says, it will be necessary for me to refer to this hypothesis so frequently that to save locution, I shall call for the hypothesis of biogenesis. This is the idea that life only comes from prior living things. And I shall term the contrary doctrine that living matter may be produced by not living matter, the hypothesis of abiogenesis. So you see, I'm not the first person who's come along and set these two hypotheses up as multiple competing hypotheses that we can now look at data to try to come up with some kind of resolution to. It turns out that this law in biology, or what is certainly treated as a law in biology, is pretty much universally acknowledged. Omni vivum ex vivo, which means all life from life. Every living thing that has ever been observed to come into existence came from a prior living thing. So, and yet everybody believes that life started somewhere. There must have been that first living thing. It's just that if you're a materialist, you believe that that must have come from only atoms and energy, whereas if you're a theist, you have an agent, an intelligent agent, typically God, to interact with those atoms and utilize those natural laws that govern the behavior of things for a specific purpose. Miller and Urey, back in the 1920s, people are still struggling with this stuff. People were beginning to understand things like biochemistry a little bit better. And you have people like the Russian Alexander Oparin. And Oparin, he's a biochemist. He's also a committed Darwinist in his own way. He's thinking about things. He's saying, well, how can we get these increasingly obviously complicated biochemical systems and stuff that we're discovering in cells, how can we get to them? Because Darwinism is pretty adamant about everything being done in little tiny steps. But it's a really big jump to go from just atoms to a living thing, as it turns out. And they're beginning to realize that. So Oparin and also JBS Haldane both suggested that accumulation of organic molecules preceded their spontaneous arrangement into living things. And you have Yuri, this guy named Yuri, he's thinking about this, and he's realizing the chemistry of living things, these biochemicals, you can make them, but it requires a specific set of circumstances. One of the things that you can see is that they tend to be reduced from a chemical perspective. And we don't want to get into oxidation and reduction and all of those sorts of things. That's a little bit too technical for this talk. But the point is, he realized that you're not going to spontaneously get these reduced molecules that you find in living things in an oxidizing environment. Our atmosphere is almost about 20% oxygen. And the world in general is quite an oxidizing environment. So he started postulating early conditions that may have existed on the Earth, and said, well, they must have been reducing conditions. And there was this graduate student named Stanley Miller. He came to Uri and he said, hey, let's test out your ideas. And he built a device that is usually diagrammed like this. I should tell you that the picture is a little bit more complicated than this because they tried multiple devices. But this diagram here kind of illustrates the one that was most successful in achieving what they were going for, which was so anyway, this is how it worked. There's this atmosphere inside this device composed of ammonia and methane and hydrogen gas, no oxygen. Because if there was oxygen, there would be a big bang. You would make water. And that would have been exciting, but also probably ruined the experiment. So there's absolutely no oxygen in there. This is a very, very, very reducing environment. There's water, and there is energy being put into this system in two ways. One, the water is being boiled, and so steam is coming off into that atmosphere, and it is circulating through this device, and it is working to do something. It's condensing over here on the left, on the right side. I'm sorry, and out of it there is a kind of condensing liquid. It's mostly water, but it turns out that there's something that is being produced in this atmosphere. That something is the mystery thing. So they took samples of it, and along with a bunch of other stuff, they got some amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So they were really excited. They saw this as the first step towards getting these building blocks for life. And wow, some people act as if they were almost halfway there to getting the first living thing. Here are some observations about this Miller-Urey device and all other devices that are trying to do a similar sort of thing. First of all, the Miller-Urey device is typical. Okay? There are lots of variations on it, but it's typical of all other simulations that seek to demonstrate production of the reduced carbon molecular building blocks of the macromolecules from which living things are built. And so first of all, the conditions necessary to produce these molecules are postulated based on what we know about chemistry. And then a device replicating these conditions is designed and constructed. Then, if the device produces the expected results, a paper is published. If your device is a disaster, doesn't really achieve things, it probably means that you don't know much about chemistry. And, you know, so usually that's shelved. Yeah, there may be one or two papers out there that do report negative results, but that's unusual. Usually it's only positive results that are recorded, at least recorded in the general literature. Can you see what's going on here? This is not a sort of naturally occurring situation. This is a situation where the human intelligence figures out what's needed, builds a machine to make something, and then if it works, they then turn around and ironically report it as evidence that this happens naturally, when it didn't happen naturally at all in the device that was made. So demonstrating that if intelligent people know enough, they can do chemistry. That's what you call teleology. It's not some unguided process. It's almost demonstrating the opposite of what is commonly claimed to be demonstrated. It is also worth noting that, number one, the postulated Miller-Urey conditions probably never existed on Earth, and that biological macromolecules, things like proteins and stuff like that, do not spontaneously form in water. Now, people have tried to come up with scenarios and more devices and machines to cause polymerization. But the more complex these things are, the less they could possibly be thought of as replicating some hypothetical conditions that existed at the beginning, early in the history of the Earth. Now, we could spend the next day or two talking about why this chemical evolution does not work. We won't do it, but this is pretty widely recognized by people who are looking at this problem, whether they are materialists, whether they're theists, or something else. And as a consequence of that, there are alternative theories that people are coming up with. One of them is that it came from outer space. The idea that some molecules that you find in meteorites could have built up here on the surface of the Earth. Some comets also, may also contain some amino acids and things. So that's interesting and intriguing. Doesn't really help to address this problem. There are multiple ways of explaining why these things might be there. But at the end of the day, a theory like this illustrates the inadequacy of these early chemical steps. Then there's what I would call, it came from outer space too, but it's commonly called panspermia. The idea that, no, they're really, we're just not going to get this buildup of the chemicals we need on the Earth's surface. So Earth was seeded from space with already living things, maybe some super advanced civilization way out there in space sent off, some kind of spaceship or meteorites or something with living things in them. And that's how life got here in the first place. And you might think that's a pretty wacky sounding theory, but it's been embraced by quite a number of eminent scientists. Francis Crick, for example, jumps to mind. He got a Nobel Prize for figuring out the structure of that double helical structure of DNA. So anyway, then there's this realization that on Earth, chemical evolution is so improbable. Actually, in our universe, it's so improbable that we don't really have enough probabilistic resources, not enough time and matter and all of those things to make the idea that life came into existence a reasonable one. So multiverses are proposed to increase the probability of winning this life jackpot. You can think of it as being something like, there's a lottery and there's 1 million tickets at, I don't know, £1 per ticket, and you're determined to win that lottery, so you take £1 million and you buy every single ticket. You are going to win that lottery, but it's going to be a lot less than £1 million. You're going to lose money on it. The problem is multiverses, other universes, cannot be studied. They can't be observed. By definition, the universe is sort of the limit of what we can observe. So we're going way outside of science here, or anything to do with observation. So note that the materialistic hypothesis tends to place the origin of life beyond the possibility of any direct scientific or historical examination. It just makes it so remote that we can't really check it against anything. Number two, all origin of life scenarios ultimately tend to appeal to something like infinite causes, infinite time, space, or matter, or, in the case of theists, an infinite God. But we're looking here at effectively infinity with pretty much all of these ideas. And that brings me back to living things. I like exceptions to the rule. And this creature, it's actually called a sea dragon, is a kind of seahorse, really. Seahorses and others in that group do something that is pretty unique, at least among vertebrates. I'm not thinking of an invertebrate exception either. Usually, it is females who become pregnant. So males give sperm in some way to females, and females have eggs inside them. Those eggs become fertilized and begin to develop inside the female, and she is pregnant. That's the normal rule of things. But with seahorses, we have males becoming pregnant. They actually have a kind of pouch in which the female deposits her eggs, and then the male fertilizes those eggs. The eggs develop inside his pouch, and then they are born, and out they come, these little tiny baby seahorses. Kind of a beautiful thing. Here is the point that I want you to think about with this. There is tremendous continuity with life, but there is also tremendous discontinuity. For every rule that you see in living things, there just seems to be an exception to it. Exactly the opposite. It's kind of like some of those pronouncements that you hear about COVID-19. Except this is reality. This isn't people changing their minds. It's just, I don't know, to me it feels like it's there just to make you go, wow, I wasn't expecting that. Just when you think you've got it all figured out, that exception is going to come along to make things interesting again. Here is how this can be interpreted. Diversity, that incredible diversity that's out there, means that the initial architecture of life must have had the capacity to be adapted to an almost unimaginable variety of organisms performing an amazing variety of functions. continuity, that those similar things that we see across all living things, means the capacity to do this, to have this kind of diversity, must have been there from the beginning. In other words, the starting point was exactly right. And that's incredible. Absolutely amazing. Now, you have people like Richard Dawkins who see things differently. Richard Dawkins is, an evangelist for atheism. And in his probably most famous book, The Blind Watchmaker, he writes, given infinite time or infinite opportunities, anything is possible. Those of you who know anything about philosophy or mathematics or probability know that's rubbish. But anyway, can you see him here appealing to this infinity or effective infinity? He goes on and says, the large numbers proverbially furnished by astronomy and the large time spans characteristic of geology combine to turn topsy-turvy our everyday estimates of what is expected and what's miraculous. So let's just ask ourselves, what kind of time do we really have available here? You'll remember that the conventional view of things is there's a big bang about 13 billion years ago. You see slightly different numbers in different sources, but plus or minus a billion years or so. What's a billion years between friends? About 4.5 billion years ago, we have the Earth forming out of the bits and pieces out there in space, and then we have this whole period that's commonly referred to as Precambrian, because at the Cambrian, which is at the bottom of this time called the Paleozoic, this layer of rock, that's where all of a sudden we get a whole lot of complex life appearing in the fossil record. So as all of this dust and stuff comes together to form the Earth, there's a huge amount of energy there. It's basically a molten ball, and it takes about 500 million years for the crust to form. Again, bear in mind, you'll see slight variations on these things, maybe by 100 million years or maybe even 200 million years. I think I've seen some people put the formation of the Earth at something like 4.7 billion years ago. But in any case, we have the first fossil prokaryotes. These are bacteria that show up in rocks that have been dated to about 3,500 million years ago or 3.5 billion years ago. Let me just stress to you, I don't necessarily buy these numbers. I'm giving you the conventional history of the Earth. This is what you'd see in a textbook or on Wikipedia or something like that. Something close to what I'm showing you here. There'll be slight variations. But anyway, then we have, about 500, a little over 500 million years ago, we have the Paleozoic. That's where we start getting all of the fossils that we usually think about. We have eukaryotic fossils, obviously, showing up before that. So when is the time? And again, remember, I'm giving you very conventional dating here, not necessarily what I believe. The time for the origin of life surely must be between the formation of the crust on the Earth and the appearance of the first single-celled organisms, these prokaryotic fossils. And that is about 500 million years, which seems like a long time. It's actually a woefully inadequate amount of time to expect to get living things forming out of nothing. But let's just go with that. Here is the problem. As more studies have gone on, we see the dates for the appearance of the first life on Earth going older and older and older. In fact, just recently, there was a paper that came out claiming that they've found in zircon crystals, of all things, carbon from photosynthesis that is 4.1 billion years old. Now, zircons are commonly used in these radiometric dating techniques. So this is about as good as you could possibly get. Do you see a problem with that? Life in this scenario is showing up 100 million years before there is a crust on the Earth. Obviously, that's impossible. That's one reason why I think you see people pushing dates back a little bit. But there's plenty of other evidence that is accumulating that is essentially making this time, these what was thought to be hundreds of millions of years, it's shrinking down to nothing or even negative. I mean, if your time for the origin of life is minus 100 million years, it makes the 7 days of creation in the Bible look pretty generous. But anyway, so significant amounts of time do not appear to be available for abiogenesis to occur. It's just not there. So even if what Dawkins and so many others have said that, okay, this can happen in incredibly long periods of time, those long periods of time, according to current understandings of things, simply isn't there. Now, that's why you need to go to something like panspermia or something, because you just have life instantly. It's almost as if God spake and it was done. But anyway, so here are some conclusions. The information integral to life that we talked about, all of that information in the DNA, the necessary interactions between components that make up living things, those different parts of all those molecular machines, the different parts of organs and so on, the organisms themselves, well, in the ecology interacting, those things, those components that make up living things, and those interactions, I should say, between components that make up living things and between living things themselves, and the extraordinary adaptability of the shared template of all living things, all serve as smoking guns against the materialistic hypothesis of abiogenesis. Lack of time and other probabilistic resources for abiogenesis further erode the materialistic view, leading to hypotheses that place examination outside the realm of conventional science. Coincidentally, the characteristics of life point to an intelligent agent as a necessary and sufficient cause for life. Both theists and materialists seem to converge on suspension of nature's laws to explain life. Ultimately, both invoke a miracle. Theists simply admit this up front. That's really the difference. The Bible, our experience of God's providence, and the creation all provide evidence of the existence of a God who plays an active role in his creation. Now, I want to end this with a quotation from the greatest British prophet of the 20th century. And some of you may have read things that he has said before. Let me just get it up here. This is George Orwell. He said, However much you deny the truth goes on existing, as it were, behind your back. You have a choice. You can choose to believe and know the kind of information that I've laid out for you here, or you can ignore it and be a kind of slave to this materialistic philosophy. But it doesn't change what is actually true out there. For those of you who are interested in more information, you may want to consider going to one of these websites. And I hope that you'll consider doing that. There's lots of fabulous stuff there. In fact, if you go to that Illustra Media website there at the bottom, if you're interested in probability arguments about the origin of life, there is a fabulous film there called Origin. That's probably where I would start. And I can tell you that until the end of this month, you can actually stream it for free. So I would encourage you to go and take a look at that film, Origin, that was produced by Illustra Media at illustramedia.com. Thank you so much for your attention. And I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Tim for your presentation, and I'm going to thank everybody who's actually listening online. We had a few technical issues, but please don't worry, we have recorded it, and our tech team will make sure they will do their best to get it on all our platforms. That includes our website, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. We will do our utmost to get it to you. I'd like to do a shout out because I believe Naomi Frank was helping our tech team earlier, and really appreciate. We won't know how it is seen the other end unless you all speak up. So we are really grateful for you highlighting if there are any problems your end. I'd also like to just give a shout to some people. They were obviously listening to me earlier on, and that's, we know there are some people online from Botswana, some as local as Bracknell, Sunderland, Sussex, Stratford, some as far as Nigeria, some in Wales. I just think it's really great that you have chosen to spend an hour and a bit with us today. We'd like you to come back tomorrow, because we are looking at Earth, the most privileged planet in the universe. I mean, and we are living on it. So please make a point and come back and join us. If you have any questions, please make sure you get them to us, because our panel will be happy to answer them on Saturday. Good night. God bless. Please be safe.